Good morning, everyone. This is Matt Langeth, a staff technologist with the Technical Advocacy Group here at Cohesity. This is episode number 3 for Thursday, April 23rd of Cohesity's The Human Factor series, where we take a look at the human aspect of some of the current situation and how businesses, both large and small, are adapting to those changes. Joining us today is Victor Bonnard, CEO of the Innovatus Group. Victor, good morning and welcome.
Matt, thanks for having me.
Victor, could you give our audience a brief introduction to yourself and a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, happy to. So as you mentioned, I'm with the Innovatus Group. We are association management and customer engagement firm headquartered in Nashville. We have offices in Washington, D.C., as well as in Chicago. And our primary focus is working with customer-led, and that's an important aspect of the work that we do, but customer-led technology organizations. In fact, we work with more customer-led technology organizations than anyone else in the world. And really, quite simply, our goal is not just to create communities. I think that's a fairly common thing to do nowadays, and that's where most organizations, most companies start when it comes to connecting with their customers. But what we believe we're doing is building communities of advocates. And that's not to imply a one-way directional relationship, Matt. I mean, really, when this works and when it works well, which I think most of our groups would be seen as industry leaders, it's a two-way dialogue. It's capturing that collective intelligence and voice and experience of the customer base and help amplifying that within an OEM, but also capture that reaction and response from the OEM and putting it back into the organizations. And so that two-way dynamic and really focusing on that two-way dynamic, I believe, is what sets us apart from many organizations that either focus just on customer advocacy or just on association management. So we've been around for about 5 years, a little more than 5 years, and in that time we've seen our connections grow tremendously, and I've enjoyed it. Prior to that, well, I've been doing this for about 20 years, with Innovatus for about 5 years. Prior to that, I was actually in campaign politics, and so in government affairs. So I will caution you, with all the politics around what you call it our current environment, it is a very deliberate mindset for me to not give you political answers, so I'll steer away from that. But it did take me a while to understand that there's alignment between the two. When you're working in government affairs, you're working in campaign strategy, you're really doing something similar. You're trying to capture collective sentiment of the voter pool. Now we're just doing it for customers and for technology professionals around the world.
So you spoke about some of those groups, and I'm sure some of our viewers and listeners are out there are familiar with VMware Users Group, or VMUG. Can you explain the relationship between Innovatus and VMUG?
Sure. So we work directly with the VMware User Group, and I've been involved with them for over 10 years. And you'll hear a lot of people say VMware User Group is about 10 years old. The roots of VMware User Group go back a long way. I mean, this is the perfect example of really organic growth and customers coming together and saying that we want to build this thing. And so the VMware User Group started as a number of groups locally around the world that ultimately got together and said, wouldn't this be powerful if we could come together? And so I want to believe this is amazing. I can even remember this. It was May 25th, I believe, about 11 years ago, that a group of the local leaders met in Chicago. I was part of that discussion, and they said, how do we pool our resources and really make VMUG something special? So if you can even imagine, back then VMUG was about 5,000, 8,000 members, really hard to count, and maybe 15 chapters. And today, that group of customers, many of whom are still involved, have grown VMUG to over 150,000 active members and hundreds of chapters around the world. Our role is to support them. So the customer continues to set the direction for the organization. Like all of our clients, there's a customer board of directors. And then our team helps execute it and put resource to it. At the end of the day, all these volunteers have day jobs, which to me has always been one of the more special things about what we do. Is these are customers that believe so firmly in the product and in the industry that they give their very limited free times to driving forward these types of organizations. So we can provide the operational support, some strategic support, but really we take this in the direction of the customer's view.
So you're talking about support and, operational capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the current situation has made some tremendous changes to what was largely in part for the organizations that you deal with in-person meetings, in-person user cons, and large-scale technology conferences. So let's break this out into two questions, if you will. What has Innovatus done in the short term to make changes to how you're interacting with these groups? And then we'll circle back around and see where your long-term strategy is taking these groups as well.
Yeah, big question, or two big questions. So let's first start talking about not just VMware's user group, but user groups in general right now. And the work that we do range from supporting small meetings of a couple dozen people to big meetings with a couple thousand people. And while I believe the second half of your question will change depending on the size of the event as we phase out of the current environment, all groups, no matter what size, face a very quick requirement to pivot their event strategy with the social distancing and the limitations for events and even the quarantines that popped up in most states. So let's start with the first one. All of our organizations realized very quickly that we were going to have to pivot away from our in-person events. Now, one of the things that we did organizationally, and I mean from an Innovatus perspective, but inclusive of that would be the team that supports VMUG, is recognize we didn't know how quickly restrictions would come, when they would come, and exactly what they would be. And so we moved very quickly to developing what we thought at the time was a contingency plan for moving some of our in-person events to virtual events. And there were a couple of core components on that. Number one, we started with cataloging, documenting what are the experiences that members get at in-person events. And that's where we wanted to start. Now, I'm not going to be that person that tells you, Matt, that going from an in-person event to a virtual event, you can deliver on all the expectations that attendees have or partners have or speakers have. You just can't do it. But I believe you got to start there. And if you start there and start trying to hit those marks, I believe it's much better than saying, let's just spin up an elaborate go-to meeting or an elaborate WebEx. That's just not going to work.
And just to interrupt you there for a second, Victor, what were some of those key points that the groups were able to look at and say, what were your top three, per se, that you found that you were trying to align and shoot for to deliver in a virtual experience as well?
Well, from a user perspective, it's education and training, and it's networking connections. And you think about what we're doing right here, and we can drill down into that, but it's making sure that those two things happen. From a partner perspective, it's lead generation. It is, we want to make connections that either will create business relationships for us today or in the future, or connect with our existing customers. And then for the OEM, like VMware in this case, is how do we support our customers and connect with our customers? And starting and designing those at that level is where we began this pivot.
Sure.
So go ahead. Did you?
So with that, now that you've identified those key components, what strategies are you putting in place? How have you tried to make that change? It's obviously it's a difficult to one. I'm sure that you had several events immediately scheduled. Mm-hmm. So what did you have to do as far as event rescheduling, and how did vendors and your end users take to those changes that had to be made? What was the feedback? What was the initial feedback that you got from some of your users, and was it one of acceptance, or did you have a little bit of pushback?
Well, there was acceptance, but the step that was between what you and I just discussed and that acceptance was we went out and actually secured these virtual venues. And so we, at the very beginning, evaluated virtual platforms, and not only evaluated them, selected one that we believed would be the front runner and proved to be the right choice. And Matt, we secured them. And that did a couple of things for our clients. One, it gave them an option. A lot of people found either the virtual platforms weren't available and couldn't be supported, or they saw a run up in the cost of those platforms. And because we were able to move quickly, we were able to get in front of that. that also allowed us, you said this in your opening too, there's so much uncertainty right now. And I think that is the most frustrating thing for so many people. We were able to provide some certainty. We want to go down this path. This is how we're going to do it. This is what the experience is going to be like. And I think that providing that very specific path forward really allowed people to understand that, hey, we've got somewhere to go, and this is going to be a workable solution. And that, to me, ultimately fueled their acceptance and their buy-in, because at the end of the day, their desire to connect never changed. Their desire to learn never changed, and we're giving them an opportunity to do that. It's just, instead of a hotel or a convention center, we're doing it in your living room.
Sure. What's the perspective been from vendors? Have you seen their level of spend equal out? Have you had a tough time to convince them that the same level of spend will be effective in these virtual platforms? What's the feedback that you're getting from them when trying to engage them in this new media?
Phases again. So, at the beginning, like you mentioned, we had already planned events. And so there was a lot of partners that already signed up to support it. And so those folks that had already signed up to invest in the in-person events were fine moving their financial support over to these virtual events initially. There's skepticism. How is this going to look? How am I going to be able to connect with either current customers or prospective customers? But there was very much initially okay, we're into it because we've already invested the money. What's great about it, these virtual platforms are very effective in terms of the engagement. They allow for one-on-one connections. If we're in an environment such as this and we want to connect one-on-one, we can go off into an ante room and actually have those connections. And then, as you can imagine, anything you do online is much easier to track, and so you get greater attendee insight. Now, that being said, we are seeing people very satisfied. So we're selling out all of our events, but as we tend to do more and more, we're hearing more and more from partners that their dollars are being recaptured by their finance departments and their organizations in general, as you can imagine. And so there is more competition for those dollars. But I go back to what I said earlier. I believe that our ability to articulate a very specific and deliberate strategy going forward has really worked for us, and people don't know where else they're going to get that type of connection. And so we continue to see the support coming in, but it is going to be important that we continue to look at that engagement and try to provide something new where we can. And I'm not, again, I want to stop short of saying create that same environment as in person, but we're mindful enough and we always strive towards that and make these events a little bit different and a little bit more unique every time.
So one of the things you talked about environment, and one of the things that I believe that people look for when they attend, whether it's a user con or an in-person meeting, even at a local level, or one of the national trade shows, is that in-person connection, the side hallway meetings, the chance encounters, the person that they've looked up to or read about it on a blog, and that they get to ask them that that quick impromptu question and get that gratification of the feedback loop. It's hard to replicate, I think you would admit, with some of these virtual events. How have you tried to, and what is out there to maybe replace that? What have you seen as far as, whether it's complementary technologies or something that's in the platform that you're currently using to allow that, impromptu meeting and that quick sidebar conversation?
Yeah. There's a lot out there, and we work with one platform that would actually allow you to create an avatar, so it would look like you, or maybe you can make it look like who you wish you looked like. I'm not really sure how that works, but you could actually create your own avatar and navigate these environments physically. And so what you're seeing on the screen would change as you wander through, and if you want to walk up to a conversation, it has proximity recognition, and so as you get closer to a couple people talking, the volume would come up and you can actually insert yourself in those conversations. And that technology, it's been around for 10 years. I used to work with something similar with Avaya 10 years ago. The platforms now are getting much more efficient and much more user-friendly. But in my opinion, I still think a lot of that is a bit gimmicky. When you are online, the most important thing you want to have is a good experience. And so I think making sure it's easy to log in, it should be intuitive. So if you're spending a lot of time setting up new technologies, which you saw with most Zooms, when people are spending the first 5 minutes figuring out, am I on mute, you're on mute. Those technologies do exist, and I think they'll get better. The one that we go to the most, it's a platform called vFairs. I don't mind sharing that with you. It does allow you to go into a room and then opens up live chat. There is a capability coming where we could spin up video immediately. So you and I could go into a room and start chatting and then make that visual connection. I believe that's going to be an incremental step that will come next before you get into the full proximity, especially when you're talking about events with thousands of people.
So you brought that up, and I think it would be a great transition point.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen most of the, if not all, of the major technology trade shows for this year move to virtual events. As you had noted, I believe that HIMSS was the first one
mm-hmm.
to make the switch just here within the previous week. I believe it was on Tuesday the 14th. We've seen that VMworld has now moved to a virtual event for both the European and US events, and Microsoft as well. I think the only one that's still out there would be AWS reInvent, but I'm sure that will, I think it's reasonable to assume that would move to a virtual event as well. How do you feel that these companies are going to innovate and pivot to a virtual event, and what interactions have you had with them? What are some of the discussions that you've had with these groups to figure out how a user community that's such a large part of some of these major trade shows is going to be interacting and participating in now what is a virtual trade show at a massive scale?
Yeah. They all have, like you said, and some have even gone further. Facebook announced that they're not doing anything until mid next year. I think I shared in the prep of this that Dell is not only not having Dell Tech World, but they're also not going to support in-person events until this is until we come out on the other side of this. So probably till the end of this year. So a couple aspects. They're having the same conversations that we are in terms of how do we engage, and they all know that, as I said, the engagement virtually is not going to be the same as the engagement in person, and so they will create their own unique engagements. But the companies that we're speaking with, many of whom you just listed off, are looking for ways to engage starting today and ultimately building up, culminating with their virtual event, and then what's going to be the tail on the backside of that. And so there's a couple different things that they're doing. First of all, trying to understand exactly what groups like ours are doing. I mean, as I mentioned, we got out there pretty early, and some of our events have been pretty large with a couple thousand people. And so it's a good proof point for them. I think you will see them delve into some of the technology that I just mentioned. I don't believe that they'll use it broad scale for the whole, what has been from a VMware perspective, over 20,000 people. They won't use it for that platform, but I do believe they'll use it, in pieces, in places where it makes sense, perhaps hands-on labs. I'm not really sure. But I do believe you'll see them compartmentalize each aspect of their event and look to create solutions, maybe multiple solutions that provide the highest value in each of those different compartments and experiences. That all being said, I think everyone is looking for the best way to connect in this current situation, but turning their focus hopefully to the next in-person events, which likely won't come until the end of next year.
I would agree with that as well. So one of the things that obviously that as technologists and interacting with the community base is communications in and of itself. And you could say that there is some companies that have done this right, and possibly some companies that maybe have just got it wrong. Which, in your opinion, is, and it could be well outside of tech, but which companies have you identified that you've felt have carried a strong message and been able to stay on brand yet be sensitive to the current situation?
Well, I'll tell you what, that last piece of your question, that being sensitive to me is critical. And without naming companies that maybe have done it wrong, I think the ones that are doing it wrong just see this as I'm going to take the calls that I make every day, and I'm just going to push them out as emails. I'm going to push them out through LinkedIn. I'm going to push them out through Twitter. And so it becomes a volume strategy. And there's not that personal connection. And anyone that's not making the personal connection and acknowledging the current situation, I think, is making a big mistake. And so let me give you some more specifics on this. And I would even ask you, I've seen it for sure. My LinkedIn traffic has gone through the roof. But it's not people saying, hey, Victor, I recognize that you work with these types of organizations and you're doing virtual events and we think we can help. It's literally people are just pushing out things that say we should connect. And so I've been more selective in not accepting those LinkedIn because it's just noise at that point. I think you get away with that a little bit more on Twitter and Instagram because of the short shelf life of a few seconds when you're scrolling through things, and people can use it for that. But people using that for LinkedIn, I think, are making a mistake. Broader media, I think there are a number of companies that are doing it right, and I think that their strategy is no different than what we've discussed to this point. I'll tell you one that I'm very fond of is how Uber has really been handled this. And I'm not sure if you've seen Uber's commercial where they show families connecting, and they really make the what I feel is a global connection that we all have through this. We're all going through this, no matter where we are, no matter our ability to handle this, where our personal situation is. We're all impacted by this. Uber, I think, has a fantastic ad campaign running right now that talks about the ways people are still trying to connect and be human. And at the very end, it says, "Thanks for not riding with Uber." And so it's an amazing sort of dichotomy there, that they're staying true to who they are, I believe, but they're also saying, "Thanks for not using us right now. We'll be here when we come out of that." I'll tell you another one that I love, I think is smart. It goes back to this idea of engaging. Is today's the NFL draft. I don't know if you're a football fan or not. I see a couple people with Pats jerseys on in the windows.
Sure.
Bud Light has a great campaign going right now, where one of the most anticipated things about the draft has been how loud will people boo Roger Goodell. And Bud Light has a campaign that you can record your boo virtually and make a donation, and they're going to take the proceeds and give it to COVID relief, but they're actually going to play these boos somehow during the draft. I think it's a fun way to capture what we're talking about here, is what's the in-person experience and how can we replicate that virtually? And then there's a number of other ones, Postmates and Grubhub and all these people that are, really working hard to support local businesses, throughout this. So it's, as you said, what's the emotional connection? Stay connected to our business, but let's not do it in a purely transactional way.
So taking that down to Innovatus, how have you changed your approach to social media, and how have you changed your comm strategy when both, from at the group level for the organization as a whole, and then the user groups themselves? How has the messaging changed?
Well, first we lean into what I just said is we acknowledge what's going on, and we also acknowledge the uncertainty, and we acknowledge the fact that there's not one solution. There's not one thing that all of us on this call are facing. And so we put out the resources, and we make that connection and remind our clients, the members of our clients, people that aren't our clients, just people in the industry, that, hey, let us know how we can help. And we've had some interesting responses from that, whether it's having more dialogues like the one we're having. Let's not talk about technology specifics. But let's just talk about how you're doing and what do you need, to where we've actually worked with some of our partners to explore things like job sharing. So, we're seeing an uptick in our business. And again, I know in prep, we talked a little bit about that. I'm happy to elaborate on how we've shifted our actual execution model. Where other organizations that may be more focused on in-person events have seen a downturn, and we've at least had dialogue to say, are there ways that we can help support you through this to take advantage of some of the new opportunities that we have? So I think that new way of thinking and really looking at this as a community is not only important for our business, I just think it's frankly socially important as well.
So you had mentioned staffing levels, and obviously, layoffs and job retention and just the economics of this situation play a large part of where we're at. So I'll ask, if you don't mind, how are you coping? Are your staffing levels at the same? Has there been any layoffs involved? And where do you see that in the next 3 to 6 months?
Yeah. Well, very directly, we have not had any staffing reductions, and in 3 to 6 months, we will not have any staffing reductions. And it was one of the first things that we did. We evaluated our business. We took a look at it, and we made that very difficult analysis. Do we have to reduce headcount? And the answer was no. Now, we made changes. We made financial changes, and I'll come back to some of the actual investments that we've made in our workforce. But we recognized that we had, from a business structure now, the ability to keep every single employee that we had going into this. And we made a commitment as a leadership team to do that. We were not going to let anyone go. Now, in between then, it required job retraining. And so we pulled our teams together. We were very direct with them. We walked them through that this is how our business is shifting. This is where we need to go. And we need to refocus and sometimes retrain our teams to execute and to support our clients and their opportunities. And, Ed, there was not a single bit of hesitation. And this was early on. So this was before 22 million unemployed. And I think that real concern set in. Our team jumped in and they were just excited. Hey, if this is what has to be done, let's do it. And so now we have in-person event planners that are used to negotiating hotel contracts and making sure AV is set up, becoming virtual event experts. How do we create virtual environments? And what is our comm strategy? And how do we bring social media feeds into online forums? Something that's completely foreign to them. And I don't know, candidly, they may not even want to do it, but they're doing it with a smile and they're doing it well. And you're seeing our company really come together. If we had challenges, Matt, I think it comes from the first couple of weeks. There's a novelty from working from home. We're an in-person environment. We've got a distributed workforce in terms of offices, but people come into the office. First couple of weeks, I think people enjoyed it. By the time you get into the third and fourth weeks, we did see some, I don't want to say disengagement, but people may be struggling a little bit more. And so we've implemented some things, some formal, some informal, to keep people engaged. So
you spoke of investments back into your workforce. Can you share some details with that? What have you found to be successful?
Sure. Well, some are fun. Show us your work partner, and we've got anything from a lizard to lots of puppies to some cats, and that's fun. Sometimes kids, and I think that kids wandering into these environments or pets is more normal. And those are the soft investments that I actually think may even pay more dividends. But we're making hard investment as well. We're in Nashville, and the hospitality industry is just really getting hit hard in Nashville. And so as a company, we've taken the position that our folks that go out and support local businesses, so I'm not talking about the mega chains, but if they support a local business, we'll reimburse them. And it's not go out and spend $20. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. But if you go out and buy a $5 cup of coffee from the local barista and you give him a $15 tip, we're going to reimburse you for that. And I believe that that's going back to that idea of social connection. That's something that I hope our team feels good about, so they can feel good about doing good for someone else and supporting, in this case, Nashville, Chicago, or DC, and trying to give back to people that have really been hit and don't have the opportunities that we have.
At this point, I'll defer to the audience if there was any questions. If someone would want to raise their hand or needs to be unmuted and has a question for Victor. No questions at this time. Victor, let's wrap this back up to what the original premise was of
Yep.
We had talked about what was in the short term of some of the things that Innovatus was doing and how we were approaching user groups. Obviously, we're still in the midst of all of this. Where do you see this going? How do you see us transitioning to, use what I think is sometimes is that overused phrase of the new normal, but it's definitely different than where we're at here at the beginning of the year. So what's your strategy? What's your outlook? How will the group now pivot in a long-term strategy to come back around?
Well, you might have seen me stammer a couple of times. I've committed to myself to stop using the term crisis or even stop using the term new normal. So other side of this or, future, I think is where we need to go. And the reason I say that is I believe right now it's time to start finding the optimism that's going to get us through it. And we need to be very careful. Optimism is a critical strength to have, but it can't be so far to where it's not realistic. The reason I say that is because in-person events will be back. I believe strongly, and there are people out there that will disagree with me, I believe strongly we will be back to high fives. We'll be back to handshakes. We'll be back to the very awkward bro hugs that you do, walking around these big conferences. That's going to come back. And that's where I find my optimism. It's going to take some time, as you and I seem to agree. It's going to be probably mid to late next year. So in the interim, take advantage of people's willingness and openness to connect any way they can, which right now is through virtual events. Define what you want the experience to be like. And, technology is rarely the solution, but it's often the enabler. And so if you define what experience you want to create, go find the technology that will do that, but always do it with the mind for what's coming in the future. I believe that you'll start to see events come back maybe as soon as early this year, later this year, early next year, but recognize that while the physical doors may be open for those events, the emotional willingness of people to attend, I think, is going to take a little bit longer for people to grasp and be comfortable with. So when that happens, I would encourage everyone to use virtual events today as their primary. Be prepared to strike a bit of a balance on virtual events and smaller in-person events in the late 2020, early 2021 timeframe, and use that as a way to prep for your larger events that will come out likely mid to late 2021. And all that I say around, it's all coming. It is coming, and this will pass. And I think that if we can see the benefits of being agile, being creative, but staying connective, that's the optimism I'm talking about.
Thank you very much, Victor. We appreciate you being on the program. We wish everyone at the Innovatus Group to be well and to stay safe. Thank you again so much for participating. On a housekeeping note, please join us next Thursday again at the same time at 11 a.m. where Michael Letchin will be interviewing the CIO of the San Francisco Giants about how changes in Major League Baseball are being implemented with this current situation. Again, Victor, thank you, and be safe and be well.
Thanks, Matt. You do the same, and I'll offer up anyone that has any questions. I'm sure they'll find a way to get in touch with us, but happy to have continued dialogue if it's helpful. But stay safe, everyone.